Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session which is meant to discuss the state of Europe and the world, and no less. I have two very interesting, powerful fellow panelists, both of them influential thinkers, and who also have the habit of often thinking out of the box. So I invite them to do a collective thinking out of the box in the session. Of course, we've heard this in previous sessions, we are in a Trumpian world, in a world where the US president is leading a revolution against domestic order in the United States and against the established order, to the extent that there is an order, for the rest of the world. And I remember there was a European Council on Foreign Affairs, Foreign Relations survey that was published on the eve of Trump's inauguration. And this survey had a number of interesting things. One of them, it said that Europeans, that was world public opinion. The survey made it clear that Europeans, together with South Koreans, had the most negative expectations of the Trump presidency, both for their own countries and for the rest of the world. So now we have an experience of less than 90 days with President Trump again in power. Remember, President Trump leading a revolution, but also somebody who doesn't like wars, who believes in deals, but who also believes that might is right. So I invite my fellow panelists, first of all, to have a first assessment of this early period of the second Trump presidency. Martin.
Well, I've already spoken quite a bit not long ago, so I tried to be brief. So the question I ask myself is, what has happened that surprises me? As I've followed this, the rise of Trump very closely. It was one of the major reasons that his rise that I wrote my recent book, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And I followed particularly closely the best American analysts, I think, people like Bob Kagan, Ann Applebaum, and so forth, on what, as well as reading a lot of books, on how democracies die, on what he might do and how it might be. So, and I read the Heritage Foundation's 2025 project. So I assumed that broadly speaking, it would be as it is. So broadly speaking, this is not a surprise to those who follow closely. It may be a surprise to the people in Wall Street who gave him billions, but in that case, they weren't paying attention. It may have been a surprise in the speed and ruthlessness of it to many Democrats, but again, they weren't paying attention. That was not surprising. So what has been a surprise? I think what he's been doing domestically is really very consistent with what I expected, with one exception. And I mentioned that in my previous comments, and I'm talking about it, which is the really quite unique and extraordinary role of Elon Musk. His central role, the fact that he has been, how long that will be, I have no idea, sort of a co-president. And I find it very difficult. That was not, to my knowledge, something people expected, and it has changed the nature and the speed of the assault on the American deep state, I think very, very substantially. He has done things, mostly I think crazy things, but he has done things with a speed and vigor that probably no other man could have done, because he's clearly a man who is completely uninhibited and actually has extraordinary intellect and capacity for getting things done. So that's definitely revolutionary. Where that will end up, I don't know. The second thing that has surprised me in the international sphere is, again, given I broadly expected, the protectionism of it, is just how chaotic it's been. That He would announce policies one day, reverse them the following day, reintroduce them in different forms. And we've gone through about 4 different trade policies in the last 90 days. And the last trade policy decision was the reversal for 90 days of tariffs on most of the world, which were themselves completely unprecedented.
But Martin,
so those are the 2 things that are the chaos and the Musk.
But unpredictability is meant to be a key element of his policy. So is the chaos intentional?
Well, this is a very interesting question. It's not the way he performed in trade policy the first time. This is really this is something I think I don't understand even now. In the first term, he was protectionist. He was focused predominantly on China, and he had a trade negotiator who did the China thing. We all knew China was going to be the focus. That's not a surprise. Bob Lighthizer, who's a proper professional trade negotiator. He cut his teeth on dealing with the Japanese in the 80s. We knew how he would work. He's a predictable, technical trade negotiator with protectionist leanings. And that's sort of what I expected this time. Because even if you want to be unpredictable, you do sort of know that if you want your trade policy to change the way producers produce, what they produce, where they produce, they need more than a day to decide how to do that. And after a while, they get completely paralyzed because they can't make any decisions because they have no idea what's going to happen next week. Now, that's not how they worked last time. They worked on one deal. It was a stupid deal. It didn't get implemented for all sorts of reasons I can go into, including the pandemic. But this is really, really different. I do agree that unpredictably is, in general, part of his method, because he enjoys showing how powerful he is, and he enjoys watching everybody scramble after him. But in the trade policy, this is almost the worst area to do it in, because somehow he does, I think, want to reindustrialize America. But who's going to invest in long-term capital in America if they don't know whether the tariffs are going to be there 3 weeks from now, let alone 10 years from now? So there's something going on here, which at the moment I can't understand. Maybe it's because he's having such fun, and it's really just the entertainment. And the fact that Lighthizer is in this administration isn't, for example, Commerce Secretary, which would make sense instead of the person who is there, who knows absolutely nothing about it, is perhaps revealing. And maybe Trump has actually, his mentality has fundamentally changed. He's much older. But this is, of course, it's related. He's a protectionist. We know that. But I could think of 25 different trade policies which he could have introduced by now, which will get him further to his goal, which is to reindustrialize America, than what he's doing. Right now, everybody who's thinking of going to produce in America knows that he's probably going to bash China. But these tariffs on China, might they be halved tomorrow when they've got the big deal? Who knows? So this level of unpredictability, I think the same applies, but Ivan will probably talk about it, in security policy. What is their policy towards Ukraine? What is their policy towards Putin? What is the deal? I mean, I think there's something, this is chaos as an art form almost. I find it, there aren't that many people in history that I can think of, and offhand I can't think of any, who operated quite like this, and it's not how he did operate in the first term.
Okay, so it's chaos more than unpredictability. Ivan, would you agree?
No, but we talked about that it's a revolution. And what we know about revolutions is that you can start it, you cannot run it. Revolution is running you. And from this point of view, this is true for every of the revolutions that we know. You're unleashing certain processes which are much more behind your control. And I very much agree that he functions as a jazz musician. So he improvises. He believes that in order to change America, you should change the world, and the other way around. But as a result of it, to talk about the plan and consistency, the first time he was not really in charge. He was co-governing together with the Republican establishment. He didn't have a Republican Party on his side. He didn't have a movement of his own. And by the way, he ended up so castrated and frustrated that also it's his revenge that he was not allowed the first time to do what he believes should be done. I'm saying this because I'm going to give you a kind of a very idiotic metaphor, because I very much agree with Martin. When you don't know what is going on, you try to find a comparison. And these comparisons are misleading, but from time to time, particularly if they're idiotic, they can give you a perspective, because normally we try to normalize everything that we see. Listen, I was trying to see, in my life, I have seen only one kind of a revolution from above happening in a superpower. And this was 1980s with Gorbachev. And on one level, there is not two more different persons than Gorbachev and Trump. Totally. By the way, on the agenda, one was for opening the world, one was about universal values, one was saying no to zero-sum games, and the other is totally on the opposite side. But keep in mind, Trump was personally absolutely fascinated with Gorbachev. He asked for meetings several times when Gorbachev was going to New York, to the extent that some prank dressed like Gorbachev and went to the Trump Tower, and Trump went to meet him. Why I'm saying this? In order to understand Trump as Gorbachev and to try to see the comparison, try to see Gorbachev with the eyes of the old communist establishment. What he was doing? Basically, Glasnost was the version of what Musk is talking about the platforms now. Put everything there, everybody should go with his own opinion. Secondly, anti-bureaucratic revolution, break the party state. Listen, if you have been member of Politburo for 20 years, this is the end of the state that you know. Certainly in international relations. Basically, go to the other side. Suddenly burning the border between the communist system and the liberal democracy, what was he's doing. This is, if you're part of the liberal establishment, you're saying he's totally burning the borders between democracies and authoritarian regimes. And he's doing this, and in my view, the most important is to understand that when some of these processes are unleashed, they start to have a life of their own. And if you now look back at 1989, you're going to see that we have been so much focused on what was happening in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe that we, in a way, missed other 1989s. We missed Tiananmen, who now probably looks as more important than the fall of the Berlin Wall. We missed, by the way, what happened in South Africa, where a young man called Elon Musk in 1989 left the country with the trauma of ending up as a minority, and very much obsessed with the demographic change that is changing everything. I'm saying all this because my major story is, in a revolution moment, try to look around and see, is there something that we are not seeing now that is going to be important before? And in my view, this is the biggest problem that I have with Europe. We are seeing Trump and we see only risks. We are saying he is destroying our world. But most of the others, and this is where I go back to the ECFR survey, which I was part of, listen, for all these Indians, Saudis, Turks of the world, the liberal order was dead even before. So they start to see opportunities. Not that they like Trump so much. And keep in mind, and this is my last point, Trump's nationalism is not going to walk easily with a traditional nationalist outside of the US. Because his view on land is the view of a real estate guy. His view of the world is about gentrification. When you see his view on Gaza, see it from the point of view of any nationalist. Nationalists believe that land belongs to people. He sees people as tenants. Nobody believes to anybody. No, but I'm saying this because this is why I don't believe, for example, the Trumpian revolution is going to walk easily in Europe. I don't see classical far-right European nationalists easily siding with him. Plus, Trump unleashed a very strong anti-Trumpian nationalism. And from this point of view, when we talk about the impact, he's not the only players. Look at the elections in Canada. If Mark Carney and the Liberals are going to win, then every Democratic leader is going to say, I can make votes on Trump. If on the other side, basically, Romania, Poland can go wrong, you're going to have a totally different lessons. And I'm saying this because the problem with the revolution is stop asking the question what Trump wants. First, because he does not know it, probably. But secondly, because it doesn't matter. This is a process which is going to have much more players. And probably this revolution is not only Trumpian revolution.
Well, you talked about, even about nationalists on the far right. Of course, an international of nationalists is an impossible concept. And this is precisely the problem, that much of the European far right may identify with Trump. But the moment Trump takes decisions and measures that hit European countries, then Le Pen and others have a difficulty in reconciling the two. Now, going back to Europe for a minute, I wrote a book that was published about 2.5 years ago entitled Europe's Coming of Age. And there I said that if Putin does not succeed in unifying Europe, perhaps a re-elected Trump may do so. Now, 2.5 years later, the combination of Putin and Trump, do you think it may do the deal? Who would like to go first?
It can or cannot. And I'm going to tell you why. Because Europe really should make a choices. It's not that it's predetermined. I'm saying this because, funnily enough, when you see the Russian-American negotiations till now, which all the time we talk that they're about Ukraine, they're about everything but Ukraine. They're negotiating Arctics. I'm sure that now they're going to talk about Iran. If you're going to ask, Russians know what they want about Ukraine, and unfortunately, they didn't change very much what Putin wanted about Ukraine from the day one. But on the American side, Trump is negotiating Ukraine in the same way Gorbachev was negotiating the unification of Germany. The story is, I'm trying to show to the others how open I am, what kind of deal that I can show that nobody can imagine before. And I do believe this is the real problem for Europe, because Europe now feels, on one level, very much threatened on the security side, because American security umbrella cannot be taken for granted. It can exist, by the way. We don't know what he's going to do with NATO, but you cannot take it for granted. On the other side, on the trade level, listen, even the people who normally you're going to say as being pro-Trump, they're not going to be happy, neither with his trade policy, nor with his trade war on China. Because probably you have not noticed, but if there is a European country that betted strategically on China more than anybody else, this is Viktor Orban's Hungary. 21% of all Chinese investment in Europe in the last years are in Hungary. So I do believe that the last thing that Orban is really dreaming about is Europe to come with 145% tariff on China. So in a certain way, Europe is going to make choices. And Europe is going to make choices from the position of strength on one level, because we're a big player. It's a big place with quite a lot of resources, quite a lot of people, but in a certain way, Europe was created and very much embedded in this liberal order, which is now kind of shattered. So on one level, we can end up with, like Yugoslavia, which never managed to survive the geopolitical constellation, which make it viable. On the other side, we can end up as the winner of the game, because both China and the US are going to risk a lot, and Martin, and you know more than me, but this decoupling is not going to be an easy divorce between the Americans and the Chinese. And I don't know how American consumers are going to react, if they're going to see some of the prices going up, if you're going to see a lot of disruptions. And Chinese are not in a great economic health too. So from this point of view, it's a world in which probably there are opportunities for Europe that there were not before.
Martin, do you think that Trump is trying hard enough to unify the Europeans?
It's a very good question. May I just make one comment earlier on what Ivan said, which was characteristically brilliant and always inspires new thoughts. I have just been to China, and it is relevant to sort of this story. And what struck me in the conversations I had, and I have known a number of leading, now relatively elderly, as I am, Chinese policymakers who were very involved in reform and opening up, and I was in various seminars with some of them, and they said what Ivan said, but they made, of course, a different parallel. they said, this is a revolution. We know about revolutions. It reminds us of the Cultural Revolution. And we had and I wrote a column about this last week, which I thought was quite good, but there we are. But the point is, what makes it similar is that Mao was the boss, right? Yeah. Now, Mr. Trump obviously isn't Mao Zedong. He didn't create the American Republic, as it were, but he is the boss, absolutely, and he is trying to force through, as Mao did, a total revolution in two dimensions: a revolution of the state and a revolution of the culture. And Mao's great attempt on the latter was to destroy all the traditional cultural hierarchies of China, notably including those within the family, which was quite shocking to them. Children are not supposed to beat up their parents anywhere, and certainly not in China. So this was revolution. And they see it, these people see it, and all of them were people who survived the Cultural Revolution, and they look on with absolute horror. But in the case of China, this led in the end to a man, very extraordinary combination, who believed in preserving the power of the Communist Party, so that was against Mao, and opening up the economy and produce modern China. So I've been thinking, if you take this Cultural Revolution view and you look at what's going on in America, and you look at where China ended up at the end of it, which was not, to put it mildly, what Mao Zedong had in mind, absolute opposite, it raises a really interesting question of where will America end up with this revolution from the top? It's a different way of thinking about what's going on. What is certain is he started a process, I think, whose ending we can't envisage. Now, then I thought about your question about, is it enough? I was thinking about why this, for European nationalists, this is particularly problematic. And again, and this will only answer, but I hadn't thought about this before. Trump is, in some very interesting ways, obviously he's a real estate man, he likes 19th century imperialism. He likes the idea that, we should take territory that should obviously belong to us. I don't think he's really joking about Canada. I'm not saying he's going to invade, but I think he feels, by the way, lots of Americans used to think, why did North America get away from us? These Brits got in the way. Well, we could surely do something about that now, can't we? And then the real estate manager and the imperialist comes together. Now, for Europeans, particularly Western Europeans, this is a big thing because we have learned one or maybe two really, really big lessons from history. Imperialism doesn't lead anywhere very good. It's mostly very expensive and uneconomic, and it tends to lead you into all sorts of imperial wars, which you'd rather not do. The First World War, in part, was that, as you know. And the second thing is, what we really don't want to do, even less than that, is to start getting real conflict over all the unsolved border problems we have. So Trump raising that is terrifying. And these are principles that no European nationalists can embrace unless they want World War III within Europe, and we've had enough of that. So I think this perspective Trump has of the world, when I agree with him, is one that has to be anathema to all European nationalists of the type we have nowadays, none of whom really seem to believe in Lebensraum or any variant of that. So to your question, on economically, politically, culturally, in this respect, European nationalism can't operate within a Trumpian framework. Now, the question to me is it possible for European nationalism to become European rather than nationalism? The latter makes operations as a collective impossible. The former might. And it seems to me Trump might be enough of a shock for Europeans to say, well, in the end, we can't defend ourselves on our own because we're far too small. Obviously, France, Germany, they're all far too small. we could defend ourselves collectively. That means embracing the idea that our nation is us collectively, not, or at least in significant part, us collectively, not our nation. And that is, I think, a necessary condition for the integration revolution. And maybe the combination of the immense pressure that is now going to come from China and America and the chaos in the world system will induce that. I would hope for it. And certainly Ivan's ideas have stimulated further thoughts about why that might happen. But I think it has to get much worse first.
I remember, in fact, one article written by Ivan many years back when he compared Europeans to monks rather than missionaries who are trying to protect their own monastery. But leaving that aside, I have a question on economics for Martin and a question on politics and security for Ivan. Economics. Tariffs, we know, is a beautiful word for Mr. Trump, but I'm not going to ask you about trade wars. The question I would like to ask you is, do you think that Trump's policies will be accelerating the demise of the dollar standard?
That's a really interesting question. As a matter of economic logic, if the trade you do with China, with the US, is substantially reduced, because basically you can't export to them, and therefore you're not going to earn dollars, right? Or you're going to earn far fewer dollars in trade. And assume this is fairly general. It will also follow, it's very important, indirect effect of the sort of protection he is imposing, is that exports from the US will become much less competitive. That will happen through exchange rate adjustments, because Americans won't be buying foreign currencies. And it will also happen through the protective effects, because coming back, a very important point, I mean, China produces a lot of the inputs into manufacturers all over the world. And other East Asians, we don't know what he's going to do with those. And that means that all the companies that are now producing behind the tariff wall will be also paying these incredibly high prices because of the tariff wall on all their imports. And that will make them relatively uncompetitive in world markets. And the result of this, that America's trade is going to shrink relative to GDP. That's the aim of these policies. It's just going to become much less big player. And that is one reason why the country will become less important economically for the world. Will that lead to massive shifts away from the dollar? Well, in itself, probably not that colossal, because so much of it is really about the financial and monetary side. But the other side of it is that to believe that the holding US dollars as your principal liquid asset, means operating the US financial markets as your principal market, and you have to believe that these assets will be safe and they will be liquid. And the sanctions policies of the US have already raised questions about that to a very significant degree. And the political power it gives them has already raised questions. But now what we are watching is a US government who is capable of pursuing policies that deeply destabilize financial markets, and they were deeply destabilized last week for absolutely no rhyme or reason. The last time this happened was in the middle of the pandemic. We knew why that happened, and in the middle of a global financial crisis. Here, it was the result of really crazy decisions by one individual who's going to stick. So it seems to me that in addition to shrinking the trade side of the need to have dollars to engage in trade, they're also destabilizing the markets, above all the treasury market, on which the US depends, and on which the US reputation depends. And finally, it's pretty clear, if you follow it closely, that fiscal policy in the US is going to be crazy. They've just passed a budget in the House, which will probably get passed through reconciliation, and it's going to be massively in deficit. For an indefinite future. For all these reasons, the world will want to get away from the dollar. The only problem they have is what else? And actually, it does fit in with what we just talked about. In my view, the only credible replacement for the dollar is the euro. The RMB is not a credible replacement for many reasons. I don't want to go through them all because it will probably bore you. But the most important reason, the Chinese don't want it, because they know it will reduce their control over their own economy. The point I've made many times over the last 20 years, the Chinese won't want the RMB to become a proper reserve currency, and a proper reserve currency is what people want, not just a vehicle currency in trade. And in any case, to have a proper reserve currency, you have to believe that the financial markets are liquid and open at all time, and the Chinese definitely don't want that. So the only competitor is the euro. So that's a genuine opportunity. It also imposes some constraints. But I do think it is perfectly possible, if the Europeans handle this very, very well, that 10 to 20 years from now, the euro, already very much the second most important, would become the world's most important reserve currency. I'm confident about that? No, but I think it's not an unreasonable proposition.
Okay, we've got almost 7 minutes, and let's finish with security. Now, we know that we Europeans had delegated responsibility for our security to the Americans. I think one point where President Trump is right is when he's been accusing Europeans of being free riders. They've been free riders. Now, we are talking about European defense cooperation. And to make any European defense credible, you need not only political will, you need money, and you need time. All right? So even, first of all, can you tell us a bit about how do you see the prospects for European defense cooperation? And if I may end up with my last provocative question, and then we will close it. And this is, Europeans talk about defense cooperation, but they also have to start thinking at some point of time about a European security architecture, assuming that peace is restored. Do you see Russia having a place in that European security architecture? And will Putin play ball with us?
In 7 minutes. No. No, listen, the problem with defense cooperation, and this is one thing that always makes me slightly nervous about the EU, when we come with a new big idea, we are selling to solve all our problems at the same time. Defense spending is also about reindustrialization. This is about this is about that. And by the way, also, if till yesterday the message was there is no money, now the message is the money and not the problem. The problem with European defense capabilities are based, in my view, on three things that are critical. The first is the major success of the European project was that we made big war on the European continent unthinkable. And this was the success of the European project. And now you are faced with your success. And it's very difficult to react to something that is not the result of your failure, but your success. Europe has a cultural problem when it comes to defense. If you talk to military, the first thing that they're going to tell you is budgets don't fight wars. People fight wars. 17% of the Germans said that they're ready to defend their country. You can spend as money as you want, unless you're going to go on a totally automatic stuff. It's going to be difficult, and this is why I do believe many countries in Europe are going to be more and more tempted by the nuclear. Because the nuclear is creating at least the false story of security in the absence of a kind of an army, which is not kind of easy to create. Secondly, Europe's dependence on the American intelligence is overwhelming. So we can tell ourselves many things, but when it comes to intelligence, it is big. And thirdly, of course, who's going to command? Who's going to take decisions? In one thing, Carl Schmitt was right. When it comes up to the use of nuclear power, it cannot come as a result of a deliberation for a long period of time. So Europe has this structural problem. On the other side, and this is the story, is that the war does not need to happen tomorrow, and I don't basically, the idea that basically the moment when Ukraine is over, Putin is going to go to Estonia is a good way to mobilize public opinion, but it's not necessarily the way that it is going to happen. And for me, there's three issues on the Russian side. First, I'm very skeptical that Trump can make a real deal on Ukraine. He would try. He wants basically a big deal. He goes to the Russians and said, let's agree on this, and then we're going to do magnificent things. We're going to do things in Arctic. We're going to do this and that. But the story is, President Putin wants very concrete things about Ukraine, and the most important is to make independent Ukraine non-existent, so demilitarized and so on. European position on Ukraine is also slightly tricky, because losing American security guarantees, now we basically try to believe that Ukrainian army is going to compensate for this. So part of the European talk about Ukraine is also about, can we make Ukrainian army strong enough, well done in order to basically defend us. This is also not easy because Ukrainians try to defend themselves first. And they're very much destroyed. By the way, Ukrainian defense industry is overperforming. They're now doing 90% of the drones on a prices which is probably 6 times lower than the one we're selling them. Which also shows you that in a certain moment, defense industry can develop much faster. And secondly, before we're having a military budget with which you're buying an American equipment, which is going to come in 5 or 7 years, because all F-16s or F-35s are overbooked. You need a different strategic culture, where the strategic culture is going to come from. And the story with Russia, Russia and Turkey are going to be the two most important relationships for Europe if you try to have any type of an autonomous story. Both of them are not easy, and the situation with Russia, while Putin is there, is going to be really dramatic because the threat perceptions of the different European countries are different. When you talk about Russia, the conversation in Bulgaria or Greece or Portugal is one. Go to Poland and the Baltic republics, this is a totally different story because history is coming back. And I'm going to end up on something that made a very strong impression on me. You know, this ECFR polling, we have been polling public opinion on support for Ukraine. From year one, you see the borders of the old empires coming back. Countries that have been part of the Russian Empire, not the Soviet one, Finland, but even Sweden, Poland, Baltics. For them, Ukraine was about them. Then you call countries that have been part of the Ottoman Empire. Bulgarian, Greeks, Serbs, I'm not talking what the governments are doing, the public opinion. Not that they like what Putin is doing, but it was not their war. And Habsburgs, like always, in the middle. I'm saying this because this type of a long history cannot be neglected. And the biggest strategic challenge for Europe is how you're creating a common strategic culture. And this is going to be something that cannot be resolved on the level of public opinion. You need a kind of a political leadership. But from this point of view, even the fact that Putin and Trump sounds quite often very similarly, makes Europeans basically react probably in the way that we have surprised ourselves how united we could be on certain issues.
Thank you. Our time is up. I'm sure we haven't solved all problems, but you certainly rose to the challenge of thinking out of the box. So thank you very much.